Good afternoon, friends. Thank you very much for this invitation to CEPT University and to give the Perspectives lecture. I would also like to thank my old friend and provost of this university, Trideep Surud, for, in fact, actually sort of encouraging me to speak about something that I've never spoken about before. And I would also like to extend my thanks to Professor Gauri Bharat, Diana Romani, and Shivani for facilitating my visit and this talk in particular. So today's talk is a very unusual talk in the sense that it's going to take a very meandering path. You might say there's no argument. You might say there are multiple arguments. It all depends on how you really read my remarks, how you interpret them. And I want to begin by saying that this talk is intended partly as a tribute to a man whom I've been reading for 45 years. The title of this of the talk, you notice, of books there is no end, and some of you who are familiar with the King James version of the Bible, you'll find, of course, a variation of this in other translations of the Bible as well. Ecclesiastes, book 12, verse 12, there is a quotation of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. And of course, at first glance, it'll appear to you that I'm going to be speaking about a subject I'm supposed to be in love with books, but this would suggest a certain kind of skepticism as well. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. And this talk, as I said, is partly intended as a tribute to Jorge Luis Borges. You're seeing a photograph of him here in this shot that was taken many years ago. What kind of man was he? Let me just give you a glimpse of that through a quotation, and then I'll go on to discuss Borges and his idea of the infinite library, and then from there move on to other matters. So about 3-4 decades ago, there was a war that was fought over the Falkland Islands between Argentina and the United Kingdom. Now, the Falkland Islands are described by Argentina by a different name. They call it Malvinas, but that's immaterial to the argument. The point is that both countries were laying claim to this piece of land. And this piece of land is a barren piece of land, and it's actually quite worthless in many ways. It doesn't even belong in some part of the world where it might play a crucial role, let's say in geopolitics. Of course, from the American standpoint, every part of the world can be geopolitically of interest, but the Falkland Islands was really a barren piece of land, and the two countries went to war over it. And Borges, who was alive at that time, said that the best way to think about the war is to think about two bold men fighting over a piece of comb. Two bald men fighting over a piece of comb, right? So that's Borges for you. Now, Borges wrote a book called The Library of Babel, and it's a book where he lets his imagination run riot. To give you a sense of what the book is about, and his relationship to books, let me first recall a comment that he made when he said, if I were asked to name the chief event in my life, I should say my father's library, end quote. In his essay, The Library of Babel, which is one of several essays in this collection, he carries the idea of a library to its logical extreme, that is, all possible books in an infinite space. So let me elaborate on that. Borges' narrator describes how his universe consists of an enormous expanse of adjacent hexagonal rooms, each of which contains the bare necessities for human survival, and 4 walls of bookshelves. Though the order and context of the books are random and apparently completely meaningless, the inhabitants believe that the books contain every possible ordering of just 25 basic characters That is 22 letters of the alphabet, the period, the comma, and space. Though the vast majority of the books in this universe are pure gibberish, the library also must contain somewhere every coherent book ever written, or that might ever be written, and every possible permutation or slightly erroneous version of every one of those books. The narrator notes that the library must contain all useful information, including predictions of the future, biographies of any person, and translations of every book in all languages. Conversely, for many of the texts, some languages could be devised that would make it readable with any of a vast number of different contexts, end quote. Now, taking the hexagonal infinite library of Babel as our starting point, you may think of my observations as standing on a hexagonal or six-pronged stool, and so therefore this talk is now going to be really divided into 6 parts. And I just want to go back to the title of it, Of Books There Is No End, some stray thoughts on the seductions of books, readings, and libraries, because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be meandering. I'm going to be looking at books, I'm going to be looking at the politics and the pains and the pleasures and the politics and the possibilities of reading. What do we mean by reading, right? And how is it that we think of that institution called a library? Borges subsequently went on to become the director of the National Library of Argentina. By the age of 55, he was completely blind. And I don't know of any individual who was as well read as he was, right? So it's worthwhile thinking about him in this connection as well. And this is a 3D rendering of this infinite library of Babel, something that is imagined, a library that would contain all possible books that you can think of, right? And all possible permutations of these books. So the 6 parts of my talk are roughly divided into the parts that are given over here, where the first is to really think about the fetishization of books and think about the fact that if you go back to the earliest periods, to remote antiquity in many parts of the world, the major figures were figures who never wrote a word. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about my adolescent years with books, because when I spoke with Pradeep, he mentioned to me that, feel free to really make it personal if you wish. So there's an element of the personal and the philosophical, the sociological, and the anthropological. And then I'm going to offer a few thoughts on the American University Library. I'm going to share some nuggets of observations about them, some of which I think will be quite novel to you. How did the American University Library become the gigantic library that it is, right? And what is this surreptitious hoarding of books in which all collectors engage? And from there I move on to the love of books, the peregrinations, the travels of books. Books travel. When it leaves the printer and it goes to a person and then it goes to a second-hand shop, it's traveled, right? So you have to think about the journeys of books as well. And I don't mean journeying only in the sense in which ideas journey, but the journeying of books. And then, as I said, the practices, pleasures, pain, and politics of reading, and finally, to the burning of books. So let me say the following, that many of the most influential people in history, or those whom I've admired at least in my childhood, and continue to admire today, lived in an age when they were neither writers nor readers. Socrates, the Buddha, and Jesus are among those who never wrote a word. Sometime around 500 BCE, however, people acquired the singular art of conversation. The Greeks, at least, and that's how it's viewed in the West, perfected this art of conversation. So if you've never read a Socratic dialogue, I strongly urge you to do so, because that's exactly what it is. There's a conversation that takes place. So Socrates was a person who liked to meander around. He liked to wander around a place called the Agora. And the Agora is essentially the marketplace in Athens. And he would strike up a conversation. Right? So he meets somebody and he'll say, well, what do you think justice is? And then the person would give an answer, and then Socrates would begin to quiz him. And if you think of the New Testament and you think of the Gospels, Jesus never wrote anything. And in fact, what he really did was he engaged in conversations. Right? He engaged in conversations. And not only with those who became his apostles, but with a vast array of people. And similarly, the Buddha, of course, never wrote anything either. They all stumbled upon the dialogue form. In comparatively recent times, no one fits the description as well, not in a similar way, but no one fits the description as well as Ramakrishna Paramhans. The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna is a collection of his teachings, oral teachings, but he never wrote anything. Now, they are perhaps the most interesting for a reason that was divined by Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was a German philosopher of the early 19th century who became deeply influenced by Indian thought, who said, and I want you to listen to this very carefully because it's extraordinary. In 10 words, what he's saying. To read is to think with somebody else's mind. To read is to think with somebody else's mind. Now, it's possible that Plato's dialogues were a way for both Socrates to keep on talking to us posthumously, a way of talking to posterity. The same could be said for Buddha's conversations as recorded in the canon. And, of course, Jesus of the parables. Right? But to return to Schopenhauer, is his idea that to read is to think with somebody else's mind hostile to books? Is that idea hostile to books? Plato noted that excessive reading is detrimental to the power of memory and leads to a dependence on symbols. He also compares books to statues. You can talk to them, but they don't talk back. So that books could talk back at you, Plato invented the dialogue form. The dialogue form is like, in some ways, the Purva Paksha of our own philosophical traditions in India, right? Because what is the Purva Paksha tradition, or what is that mode of philosophical reasoning? It anticipates the reader's questions and allows for elaboration, the flow of thought, and so on. There is one further consideration. We've been reading only for a very short period of time, if you look at what we call recorded history, but telling tales or stories has been happening for thousands of years. And that's what parents do when they read a book and send their children off to sleep. It's, of course, a different matter, and many of you, when you move into parenthood and you start reading to your children in bed, you'll realize that you'll go to sleep before they do, right? But that's a different matter, right? And I have vivid memories of this because I read to my son the 8-volume manga of the Buddha's life by Osamu Tezuka, 1 chapter a day. I think it took about 3 months to cover the entire 8 volumes. The writer Amadou Hampate Ba once said that in Africa, when an old person dies, it is like a library that has been burned. That's the power of storytelling. But let me return to the metaphor of burning in part 6. Part 2, adolescent years with books. There are many writers who will tell you that their first recollections of childhood are of books and of the library at their home. In the anthology called The Pleasures of Reading, edited by Antonia Fraser, the majority of the 43 writers whose lives spanned 76 years recalled reading as a childhood passion, even addiction. The writer Patrick Leigh Fermor, whose views are echoed by the majority in this anthology, describes how learning to read at the age of 6 turned him from an unlettered brute into a book bedridden lunatic. That's his phrase. Right? Now, I have no such recollection at all. As a young boy, Borhe would visit the National Library with his father. I have no recollection of anything of that kind either. Right? Oliver Sacks has written that he learned to read when he was 3 to 4 years old. His favorite room at home was the library, a large oak paneled room with all 4 walls covered by bookcases. That's not the case for me at all. What I do know is that my father taught English at a small college in Sonipat for a year or two. This is in the early 1950s. He had earned an MA from Punjab University. I think there weren't too many people back then who had gotten a master's degree in India, but he was certainly among those who had. And I have in my collection a few odd volumes from the shelf or two of books that he had acquired, including some of the plays of Shakespeare and some volumes of English romantic poetry. But apart from that, as I said, I have really nothing in common with all of these writers whose warmest memories are of a library at home, reading when they were 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. Just how then did books come into my life? My father joined the Indian Foreign Service, IFSB, not A. When I was 11 years old, my father was transferred to Jakarta, Indonesia. What I do know is that when we went there, I didn't know a soul. And that is when I think I began to acquire an interest in books. So there is a certain relationship of books to loneliness. Right? Among the first books I remember reading is The Godfather, and gasping when I came to page 18. Why gasping when I came to page 18? Because it has a description of a sex scene. I think this is the first time I'd ever encountered a description of sexuality, sort of rough sexuality, right? Where Sonny Corleone, who's the eldest son of Don Vito Corleone, is having an affair with his mistress while his sister is getting married. That very moment. And of course, in those days, if you wanted to read a book like The Godfather, well, what you had to do was you had to hide the small paperback between the pages of your chemistry book or biology book or whatever the case might be. Right? Now, a little after I turned 13 years old, we returned to India. The next episode of how books came into my life has to do with a lending library, which was around a 15-minute walk from my home. Now, the lending library is becoming obsolete even in India. I barely know of any lending libraries in Delhi. And a lending library is not a public library. Those are two different institutions. A lending library is a private institution. This one was called Capital Library. It testifies to how imaginative we are that another person set up a lending library about 4 blocks away and called it Capital Library as well. So the original one then called it the New Capital Library, right? And so this New Capital Library became the place that I would run to every day. We don't have in India, by the way, a tradition of sociological inquiry, I would argue, into such institutions. Because we think that the only things that are worthy of study are electoral systems, caste, communalism, right? And things of that sort. You know, what the sociology of everyday life is on an Indian street and how that has changed over the course, let's say a meticulous record of it over the course of 6, 7, 8 decades, no one has bothered to do that. So there was in addition to the lending libraries, there was of course a public lending library system, which has also, like many other similar institutions of that kind, almost completely collapsed in most parts of India. And I want to reinforce a remark that was made by the novelist Doris Lessing when she wrote that, quote, "A public library is the most democratic thing in the world." what can be found there has undone dictators and tyrants. End quote. Demagogues can dictate what must be written. There is a tradition of panegyrics, praising, right? Dictators. Look at India, very good example. Look at the United States. Any number of countries, you can see the panegyrics there, right? But what is in a library cannot be written off, right? So there were two institutions, two parallel institutions, which were still very much a part of my childhood, the lending library and the public library system. But let me turn to the lending library, because that's the library that I visited most often. It was run by one Mr. J.N. Rati. He was an ex-army officer who walked with a discernible limp. We formed a close friendship that lasted even after I left India and well into my post-college years. I have the most vivid memory of him. One of the reasons I have the most vivid memory of him is that that's where I first encountered the novels of James Hadley Chase. All right? Which brings me to this slide. This is not meant to waken all of you who are sleeping, but images of this kind can certainly produce that effect. So, these would sell in the millions. He had an extraordinary gift for titles, right? You can see some of the books here, and Then It Happened, and What's the It? One Bright Summer Morning, and there's always this tantalizing blonde there, skimpily dressed, double shuffle. Here's another lot of them. You never know with women, you never know what. We don't need to have that because the title, it's actually quite extraordinary. I hold the Four Aces. And here is a sampling of some of the other titles. No Orchids for Miss Blandish. In fact, that was his first of his 95-some mystery thrillers, published in 1939. The Dead Stayed Dumb. You Never Know with Women, of course. Come Easy, Go Easy. Just Another Sucker. The Way the Cookie Crumbles. You're Dead Without Money. Knock, knock. Who's there? Right? So on and so forth. And what were these novels about? By the way, he wasn't an American, but the novels are almost all set in cities such as Los Angeles. And so everyone was driving a Cadillac, and then you had these drop-dead gorgeous blondes. When you're a 13, 14-year-old young boy in West Delhi, right? You don't really know what the distinction is between brunettes and blondes. All one knew was that he had a fondness for blondes, and that the female species was deadly, but blondes by far more so than brunettes, right? I mean, this was the world that he conjured up, and this is the beginning of my adventure with books. Now, there was competition, by the way, to get the latest James Hadley Chase, because Mr. Rati would let us know a day or two before the next one is coming. And there was, in particular, the school I went to, Springdale School, there was a girl in my class, her name was Sunita, and she was also very much into Chase. And so we would both chase after Chase, right? I mean, who could get to the doorstep first to get that highly desired volume, right? There was a craving. Now that's important, because when there's a craving for books, that craving for books can then translate into other kinds of books. You see, it doesn't really matter so much what you read in your early years. What matters is, do you read at all, right? From my childhood days, I have another very strong memory. And this is the time when I contracted jaundice. I was taken out of school and practically isolated. It took me nearly 2 weeks to recover. In the latter stages of that illness, that is in the second week, when I was a bit better and able to sit up in bed and began to recover, I remember copying long passages from two writers on blank sheets of paper. Oscar Wilde and Rider Haggard. Many of the passages had to do with women. I I think I'd been reading too much Chase. Oscar Wilde clearly struck me as being clever, and I have some sense that if one could quote him, it would make one sound very sophisticated. These memorable lines were from plays such as The Importance of Being Earnest and Lady Windermere's Fan. Lines such as the following, quote, I can resist everything except temptation. When the gods wish to punish us, they answer our prayers. Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much, right? Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. End quote. I didn't realize then another reason why I may have been attracted to Wilde, and just a few years later to Henry David Thoreau. When no one walks with you, because think about who Wilde was. He was an eccentric. And you know that he was, for those of you who know something about his life remotely, he was sent to jail because he was convicted of homosexuality. And that was, of course, a criminal offense, a very serious criminal offense. Right? When no one walks with you, be prepared to walk by yourself. Or to put it another way, that contrarian streak was being formed within me from a rather early time. Now, when I was around 15 and a half, I left for the United States. The second evening that I arrived in the US, I stepped out of the hotel room in Washington, D.C. There are lots of interesting stories to be told there, but there'll be a real digression. Their meandering will become too excessive, so I'll leave those aside. It was a cold October evening. I asked for directions for a local bookstore, a second-hand bookstore, because I had heard that the United States had many second-hand bookstores. And lo and behold, within 5 minutes, I had reached a bookstore, where I purchased immediately a few paperback issues of Nick Carter. Okay? I mean, I should really feel embarrassed to talk about people like Chase and Nick Carter, but I have to, partly because it gives you a sense of what kind of world one inhabited at that point in time, right? Now, at least 261 novels were published with the character Nick Carter, who was first introduced in 1886 in Pulp Fiction as a detective. No actual author is credited. They were ghostwriters. The Wikipedia page on Nick Carter says the following, quote, the title character of the series serves as Agent N3 of AXE, a fictional spy agency for the United States government. The novels are similar to the literary James Bond novels, low on gadgets, high on action. Sexual encounters in particular are described in detail. And these are, so this is another Chase cover, but here are some of the covers that you find. By the way, these books now are very hard to find. You know, these are collector's items, this kind of almost, you know, Pulp Fiction, right? The Devil's Cockpit, Saigon, and once again you can see, you know, the scantily clad women. The little blurbs are just actually quite extraordinary. I don't have time to read them here. A Killmaster Spy Chiller, and you know, then you'll get the Hulk here, and then the woman, you know, behind him. And I can tell you they get actually quite vivid, you know, both in the covers and their descriptions, the Nick Carter novels, right? Now, looking back at those years, I've had to think about a few things. These writers today would be considered guilty of the most egregious offenses, sexism, Orientalism, and so on. I had no awareness of all this when I was in my mid-teens. I also inhabited, as you may have surmised, if you've been thinking about what I've been saying, a rather Anglophone world. But as I look back and try to recall my friendships at that time and the socio-cultural milieu of the public library, that public school that I attended, I'm reasonably certain that most of my fellow students were similarly caught in the world of English speakers, readers, and writers. What kind of literature do we in India have? And I suspect the same could be said for people in all of the global south. for a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old who has left behind children's books but has not yet inherited the world of what we call the classics, whether that be Dickens, Shakespeare, the great Russian novelists like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, or the novels of Tagore, and the short stories of Premchand and Manto. Right? What kind of literature do we really have for our 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds who haven't, as I said, graduated to the classics, but who are now leaving behind children's stories? Did we ever have a literature that might animate a youngster in his or her mid-teens and give them, for instance, some understanding of what is called sexual passion? Now, a few weeks later, we moved to a home in the vicinity of the capital. That is, a few weeks after arriving in the United States, in an area called Arlington, and that's where a different relationship with books started for me, in Arlington County Public Library. Right? And I want to be very brief here and say one thing. There is an intrinsic relationship between the development of the middle class everywhere in the West and a public library system. That is not the case in India. And it's a hugely significant thing, because I regret to put it this way, I'm part of that same class. The middle class in India is only a consuming class. It is not a class that is invested in notion of public goods, which is the origins of the middle class in France, in England, in the United States, all over Scandinavia, and in many other parts of Europe. Okay? All right, let me move very quickly to the third segment. University life, the American University Library, and what I call the surreptitious hoarding of books. The Milton S. Eisenhower Library, and that's what you're seeing over here, at Johns Hopkins University, where I arrived as an undergraduate in 1978, was a revelation. How could it not be a revelation? 6 floors of this. Everything open stacks. Everything open stacks. The entire library, by the way, except when you enter into the foyer, is built underground. Okay. So this is the principal library of the Milton S. Eisenhower Library of Johns Hopkins University. The library's hours were 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. It was closed for only 5 hours. Right? And in those 5 hours, if you were one of these night owls, you could retreat to the undergraduate library, which was open 24 hours. Right? For the first time in my life, I experienced what it is to have the freedom to select one's own reading, the freedom to follow whatever paths I wanted. Right? And here's another. So I picked black and white photographs, and you see the very comfortable sofas on the right, because that, to my mind, is a very crucial ingredient of a good library, where you can comfortably read and comfortably take a nap. Let's be very candid about it. When you have a book, you're very likely to take a nap. So all libraries should be attentive to that. They're not. All right? Now, it is also at Johns Hopkins that I encountered a private library that left me dazzled. This was a library of Richard Maxey, director of the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins, where I earned both of my degrees. He was an absolute polymath. And this is his private library. Right? Dismantled 5 years ago, when he finally died in his mid-80s. He had a private library of something like 70,000 volumes. And, when he passed away, so the curators from Johns Hopkins University, because he'd been a professor there for 50 years, he had earned his PhD there. He had a lifelong association with his university. They came there, 6 of them, they spent a week, and they found 18th century editions of Voltaire in kitchen drawers. you know. And he played in every respect, he played the role of the professor, you know, the male professor, the pipe, right? It goes with the territory, as they say, to use that English expression. And here he is, the books all over, crawling out from, you know, every nook and corner that you can think of. Right? And the man was exceedingly modest with his learning. You know? Yeah, I was an undergraduate and wanted to have a discussion, and then you'd go to his office, and if no one is there to see him, he would usher you in, he would light his pipe, and then you'd have an hour-long discussion. That's the kind of person he was, and that's the kind of, the library he had matched the kind of person he was. This is my library, relatively modest. It's not the entire library, it's one portion of the library, but this is where, of course, I began to acquire an interest in books, you know, right? And like Maxey's library, a lot of the books are doubled up. Now, there's no order, and many people say, including near and distant members of the family, that books should be, well, if I can't find a book, what use it? No, no. In fact, the real idea of a library is that there should be books that you should never read. Not all books are meant to be read. Unread books are an essential part of a library. That's the ethos of a library. It's crucial to understand that. Invariably, you get the question, someone comes and sees a library, and the question is, you can suppose what it is. Have you, sir, read every book in this library? Well, of course not. You know, I mean, if you've got 500 shirts, have you worn every shirt that you have? Of course not. So, this is how one began to think about books, and I'm going to say a little bit about what it means to collect books and to what extent they become a liability or not, and how one should think about what a collector is. Right? This is another angle into a different part of the library. Same, my library over here. You're just seeing different angles and different shots. Right? So, and I'll move to this library in just a moment, but I want to just say a few things very quickly. The last few portions I'm going to go through a bit more quickly. When we think about university libraries in the United States, I want to give you an example of something that you would never think of when you're contemplating or wondering how they came to acquire the collections that they have. So this is a University of Chicago library. This is where I earned my doctorate. And this is an example of brutalist architecture. All of you here are students of architecture, so I won't describe what brutalist architecture is. It's an example of brutalist architecture. The library is about 65, 70 years old. You can see that massive block there. You know, the concrete that has not been adorned, as it were, in any way. All right, and this huge dome that you see in front, I haven't actually seen it because I haven't gone back to the university in the last 15 years, and this was put up 11 years ago. So this dome is a seating area, and underneath they have a storage facility where they use 5 gigantic robots and cranes, massive cranes, to retrieve books. So within 4 minutes they can retrieve any of the 3.5 million books that are stored in this portion of the library, okay? But I want to just show you the library as I saw it, and then I want to tell you that one story about it before I move on to the next section. So this is the entrance to the University of Chicago Library, what is called the Joseph Regenstein Library. We used to call it the Reg. Practically lived there for several years. You know, you had classes and then you went to the library. And this is another shot. This is the front entrance of the library. The library's collection is in the neighborhood of around 10 million books. This is the interior, so every floor, so there were 5 floors. They had this, in the middle you had this beautiful stairway, and you could walk down, of course, the entire length of the stairway into every level, or walk up. So if you walk up to the 5th level, That's where the South Asia collections are. Now, when I went there for the first time, arrived there in 1984, I'm going to use just a colloquialism, I was blown away. And why was I blown away? Because when I started walking down the shelves, what did I find? Thousands of novels in Bengali, in Tamil, in Telugu, Oriya, Punjabi, Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi, Kannada. You name it, every Indian language, every novel ever published, it's all there. How do they acquire such a collection? It has to do with wheat. It has to do with the fact that in the 1950s, when India was highly dependent on the United States for wheat, India was not self-sufficient in food production. So the United States Congress passed what is called PL 480. Some of this wheat was gifted, most of it was not gifted. It was sold at a highly subsidized price. But the Americans were paid in rupees. The rupee was a worthless currency. It was completely non-convertible. So what would the Americans do with billions and trillions of rupees? And what they did was, and this shows you the relationship between power and knowledge, very simply. What they did was they set up a Library of Congress office in Delhi, and they purchased 40 copies of every book published in English and 13 copies of every book published in all the other Indian languages. And they shipped them off to designated research libraries in the United States. And that's the PL 480 program, and that's why the best American libraries have South Asia collections that no library in India can even remotely think of matching, not even the National Library. Not even remotely. So there is a politics to these libraries, right? That's one of the things that I'm simply trying to alert you to, okay? But what also struck me, and I will conclude this section with that, is that, again, everything was open stacks. And so you could walk into the library and you could actually check out an edition, okay, of Hobbes, published in 1780. Just check it out. You don't have to go to the rare books room. Of course, they had rare books room too. But if they have 15 editions of Hobbes from 1750 to 1830, not all of them are going to go into the rare collection room. And this is the very opposite of what I discovered when I was back in India continuously. I went to these so-called Gandhian institutions. And what I find at these Gandhian institutions, what I called Tala Sanskriti. All the books were locked away in cupboards and almaras, and you couldn't access them. What's the point of books if you can't access them? And this was the very opposite, okay? Where, as I said, it was all open stacks. Now, so it is under such circumstances that I became a collector of books. Walter Benjamin has a wonderful essay called Unpacking My Library, where he refers to what he calls the spring tide of memories, which surges towards any collector as he contemplates his possessions. Right? So when I begin to look at the books, memories come swarming in. And I can tell you, I know apropos of almost every book I have in my collection, where I got it and when I got it. Did I buy it in London or New York or Dublin or Delhi or Bombay? And was it in 1988 or 1992? Almost every book I have some recollection of that. These memories just come swarming in. And what is very interesting is that the collector, like myself, is filled with some anxieties. So what happens? You go to the home of someone, they're very proud of their collection, and I think to myself, what a paltry collection, 500 books, fancy bookshelves, but half the books are garbage anyhow that they have. And yet my eyes set upon one or two books. And then I think to myself, I don't have that book. What is the book doing in this person's home? It doesn't belong there. It really belongs to me. See? Now this is the kind of essay that Walter Benjamin writes. When he's talking about what does it mean to be a collector, what are the anxieties, how do you get afflicted? That no matter how many books you have, when you see someone having something, you think that, this book's proper place really is on my bookshelves. It really is on my proper bookshelves. And that's how you become the surreptitious hoarder and collector of books. And that's what I keep on trying to tell my members of my family and others, some who sometimes have anxieties about my book collections and my hoarding tendencies, that this is just inherently part of the problem of being a collector of books. Now, Henry David Thoreau, had something wonderful to say about this, because Henry David Thoreau, whom some of you here will perhaps recognize as the author of an essay called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. Right? So he also published a book called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, 1,000 copies of which were printed, and 3 years after they were printed, the publisher sent him a note and said, please come and collect the 780 copies that are still unsold, because they're taking up too much space in my warehouse. And so Thoreau brings them back. And this is what he says, right? And you'll see why I'm mentioning this, right? I'm going to quote him here. For a year or two past, my publisher, falsely so-called, has been writing from time to time to ask what disposition should be made of the copies of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack River still on hand, etc. So I had them all sent to me here, and they arrived today by express, filling the man's wagon. 706 copies out of an edition of 1,000, which I bought off Monroe 4 years ago, that's the day of the person, etc. The wares are sent to me at last. They are something more substantial than fame, as my back knows, which has borne them up 2 flights of stairs to a place similar to that to which they trace their origin. Of the remaining 290, 75 were given away, the rest sold. And here is the punchline. I now have a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself. Over 700 of which I wrote myself. Is it not well that the author should behold the fruits of his labor? You have to be exceedingly wise to be able to think along those lines. The true book collector is thrilled at the thought that he has given freedom to a book languishing in some old bookstore or lying unattended somewhere, in an attic, for instance. To a book collector, as I've said, the true freedom of all books. So here, you see, we're thinking very differently about books. Books aspire to be free. It's not just individuals who aspire to be free. The true freedom of all books is somewhere, the collector says, on his shelves, right? And once again, I want to reiterate that these are the anxieties of every collector, and I'm certainly thinking of myself, right? Because if I put all my collections together, I have something in the neighborhood of about 30,000 books. But I can't tell you these pangs of anxiety I feel whenever I chance upon a book which I think really belongs to me, and that in the previous life, this book certainly did belong to me. Right? So this is how we have to animate the world of books. Now I have several more pages on this, but I'll skip all of that. I want to get to the last 2 parts very briefly, on reading and on the burning of books. Okay? Now, from collectors of books, we move to readers of books and the practices, principles, politics, and pleasures of reading. Read in order to live. So says Gustave Flaubert, peremptorily in a letter to one of his friends in June 1857. Many paeans have been written, many panegyrics, praises have been written to reading. Let me call to your attention a few, such as a famous pronouncement of Umberto Eco. Beautiful quote from him, where he says, "A person who does not read lives one life of maybe 70 years. All right, now maybe 80 years, 90. The reader lives 5,000 years. The reader lives 5,000 years." Herodotus, the writer of a work called the Histories, which date back to 600 BCE, said that wherever you go, you run into a story. The 19th century French symbolist poet Stephen Mallarmé, in a modern variant of this, shall I say a bookish variant of this, said that everything leads to a book, or more precisely, the world exists to end up in a book. Reading has often been thought of as a duty or chore. I think schools in particular are to blame for that. You're given an assignment. Whatever is an assignment is not worth doing usually. There's a natural tendency to think that way. So, if you're assigned, a play by Shakespeare, it becomes a chore. It becomes a duty. I think so we'll have to think about how we can enter the world of books and how universities and schools can try to enter into a world of books without making them a burden, without making them a liability. There is also some people who have argued for the pleasures of reading, but seem unaware that it is rather absurd to suppose that pleasure is inherently conducive to one's well-being. It's a very odd idea, by the way, to think that everything should lead to pleasure. So why do we even use the phrase, the pleasures of reading? I mean, sometimes you want to read because you need to be tormented, you need to be conflicted, you need to be distressed. Right? That can be a very legitimate reason for reading. Right? Shouldn't reading fill me with some sense of discomfort? At least some of the reading that I do. Right? Or to raise a rather more pedestrian consideration, does pleasure have something to do with my pace and style of reading? And this is apart from the fact that all readers have what I call a page count anxiety. How many pages did I read today, right? There's this kind of thing that, feel like, okay, well, I have to have read so many if I'm going to be considered a professor or a scholar or a writer or, something of that kind, right? Doesn't the very idea of the page count militate against the pleasure of reading? And Francis Bacon, recall what he said, quote, "Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested." He might have added, by the way, that some books are meant to be spit out. Or at least that's what Ambedkar, to take one notable instance, thought of the Manusmriti. Right? He spit it out, literally. He did more than spit it out. He burnt it. We'll get to that in just the last section very momentarily. Right? Now, there is a school of thought which most people who are literate subscribe to in some measure, that is, most middle-class people, that reading elevates our character, makes you into a better person, all of that. I think perhaps this should also be put to some interrogation. Quote, "For the desire to read, as Virginia Woolf observed, like all other desires which distract our unhappy souls, is capable of analysis." I would like to put for your consideration another way of looking at reading. If reading has any attraction, it resides in its inherently private and antisocial character. Consider this passage, which describes a person reading. Quote, "When he read, his eyes scanned the page, and his heart sought out the meaning. But his voice was silent and his tongue was still. Anyone could approach him freely, and guests were not commonly announced, so that often when we came to visit him, we found him reading like this in silence, for he never read aloud." End quote. The scene thus described appears unremarkable. A person, quite likely at his home, is absorbed in silently reading something. But the passage is nothing if not exceptionally remarkable. It is the first detailed description, what I just read out to you, in Western literature, perhaps in world literature, of a person engaged in the solitary act of reading to himself, not to others. Not reading aloud. This passage is what Saint Augustine of Hippo, author of the Confessions and A City of God, witnessed when he visited another church father, Saint Ambrose, in Milan around 385 CE. So about 1700 years ago. 1800 years ago. This silent perusal of the page was unusual. When Augustine says that Ambrose never read aloud, the reader may infer that the common practice was to read aloud. And so what he's watching is something which signifies a momentous shift in global consciousness. The act of reading alone. Right? Now, if we extrapolate from this passage, we begin to fathom that what is so absolutely extraordinary about the notion of a public library is not only the admirable idea of the notion of goods, here knowledge, shared in common, belonging to the commons, but rather the fact that in the act of reading singly in public, we forge a community. Conversely, it is in the act of reading in a communal space that we individuate ourselves. Right? So the public library is that place where you read both singly and, so to speak, collectively. Right? I mean, it's quite remarkable if you think of a public library now in this way, and that's what I'm attempting to do. And this entire set of observations is to give you a very different way of thinking about things that you may take for granted. The neurologist and public intellectual Oliver Sacks, author of such books as The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Hallucinations, commented on this uncelebrated aspect of reading in a library, quote, all of us in the library, he's describing what happens when he first goes to a public library and then begins to understand what's happening. All of us in the library were reading our own books, absorbed in our own worlds, and yet there was a sense of community, even intimacy. The physicality of books, along with their places and their neighbors on the bookshelves, were part of the camaraderie. Handling books, sharing them, passing them between us, even seeing the names of previous readers and the dates they took the books out, right? Because, the library would stamp the dates, you see, right? You may surmise from this observation that neither Sachs nor I are much taken in by the idea of the digital libraries can play the same social, critical, and cultural role that libraries have played over the centuries. Every book is a collaboration between the writer and the reader. When we invoke Gandhi or Shakespeare, I deliberately put them in apposition together, okay? Partly to undermine received notions of literature, because nobody would read Gandhi as literature. They should, right? You read Shakespeare as literature. We are not merely invoking their works when we invoke their names, but rather the decades, and in the case of Shakespeare, centuries of interpretation through which their works are filtered to us. So Shakespeare is not just the plays that he wrote, it's the 500 years of the interpretation that have become part of who Shakespeare is. There is always a tension between the reader and the writer, and the French encyclopedist and Enlightenment thinker Diderot captured it beautifully when he asked, quote, "But who shall be the master? The writer or the reader?" Many people are accustomed to thinking that it is the authority of the writer that shapes the reader's response. certainly sometimes, if not often in the reading of a book, we find that the writer can carry us along and has even taken possession of us. But to my mind, what is equally true is the overlordship that every reader exercises over a book. Once you have taken possession of a book, and here I quote Rory Stewart, let me quote him again. Once you have taken possession of a book, you can inspect a writer's mind in all its shades and dimensions. You can establish a relationship which would be intolerable to a living individual. That is, you can wake up in the morning and wake up the book. Try waking up your spouse every day at 4 o'clock and see what happens. But you can wake up the book and you can get into a conversation with the reader, with the writer of that book, right? And then you can throw it away. And you can stop at mid-sentence. It's a very different relationship. Why do we think that? It's because we have been seduced into thinking of the authority of the writer. All right? But we are not done yet. For Proust, at the end of everything there is Proust, right? Adopts a still more radical outlook. The book that you read is not someone else's book, he says. The true writer is not writing a book that you have not read. As he put it, in search of lost time. You are not the reader of someone else's book, but only reading what is written within yourself. Quote, it seemed to me that they would not be my readers, but readers of their own selves. My book being merely a sort of magnifying glass like those which the optician at Combray, that was an optician shop in Paris, used to offer his customers. It would be my book, but with it I would furnish them the means of reading what lay inside themselves. So I would not ask them to praise me or to censor me, but simply to tell me what it really is like. I should ask whether the words that they read within themselves are the same as those which I have written. That's amazing. What Proust is really saying about what is the writer of a book. And that brings me then to my coda on the burning of books. This is the shortest part of my ruminations. It'll take but 2-3 minutes. Now, in a 6-legged stool, so this is the 6th part, if one leg is missing, the stool may be a bit wobbly, but it will still stand. So therefore, we can have a shorter 6th section, right? Because the rest of the talk will still stand, so to speak. This last part on the burning of books is familiar to us from a number of contexts, such as the public burning of the Manu Smriti by Ambedkar decades ago on December 26th. I dare say that Mohandas Gandhi would never have burned a book, however abhorrent he may have found it. The deliberate burning of books is but another form of himsa, violence. It's a form of violence principally because the supposition of the book burner is that he alone is possessed of the truth, the entire truth. The burning of books is but another form of epistemicide, and the Nazi burning of books, much like the scholasticide and epistemicide that have been carried out by the state of Israel in Gaza and increasingly in the West Bank, although it's less visible to some people, have taken that form of the subjugation of the Palestinians and the suppression of the idea of the dignity of the individual to their logical conclusion. The question of the burning of books was also brought home to me by the fires that were consuming Los Angeles last month. And I was asked just before the talk by someone about the fires and my library. I found it was very charming. You know, I got 200-300 emails at least, many from people entirely unknown to me, and and they said, Professor Lal, they'd somehow seen Ravish Kumar's video, I suppose, and said, we're just inquiring, is your library okay? And then some of them, as an afterthought, P.S., are you okay as well? Okay. It was very charming, I must say. Right? So, everyone had this concern. I very much appreciate that. But there are a number of other things, excuse me. Number of other things that I want to just bring into play very, very quickly. You recall that remark which I had shared with you before, which really came home to me vividly. That remark is by this African writer who said that when in Africa an old person dies, it is like a library has burned down, because that old person is the repository of all the memories of that village, of that clan, of that tradition, of a certain style of thinking, right? And I was in South Africa for 4.5 months before we came here, and so there this idea came vividly before me, right? But the burning of books has always been present in my mind for other reasons. There was an Indian anthropologist, social anthropologist, M.N. Srinivas. He's the person who authored the idea of Sanskritization. Now, M.N. Srinivas's entire library burned down. And he had written a book. It hadn't been published yet. And he only had it in manuscript form. These were the days before computers. And he lost the entire manuscript. The entire manuscript. Right? And this is one of those things where people say, how unfortunate. If he'd been in the computer era, there wouldn't have been any such problem. I don't think that's a very judicious or wise way of thinking about it, because let me tell you the aftermath of this story. So then M.N. Srinivas went to the publisher and said, well, I don't have the manuscript anymore. And the publisher said, do you think you can try to reconstruct it from your memory? And he wrote what is by far the best book he's ever written, called The Remembered Village. Because it's a book where he was unburdened of all the scholarship that he knew. He was a free bird, so to speak. Very poor cliche, pardon me. But it was his best book. The Remembered Village. And beautifully, elegantly written. It's almost like a novel. And so rich in thought. And luckily there are no footnotes. Nothing to clutter, the text. Nothing of that kind. The Remembered Village. His library burned down. The library of one of the greatest scholars of Gandhi in the world burned down. But he never regretted it for a moment. That's a man who understood Gandhi. I'm speaking about Raghavan Iyer, who wrote a book called The Moral and Political Thought of Mahatma Gandhi, whose son some of you may be familiar with the books of his son, Pico Iyer. But he lost his entire library to an act of arson. All right? Now, all of this was swarming in on me when the fires were going on in LA, and I was getting all these emails. And there was anxiety, yes. And the main part of the library and the home has about 20,000 books, okay? And so there was a friend of mine who called me, he was very anxious. He said, Vinay, what are you going to do about this? You need to do something. He said, I'll send a U-Haul, a huge U-Haul, and with 2 people, and they'll just stuff everything from the library, throw it quickly into the U-Haul. Well, long story short, we were never really in completely imminent danger. It was the fires were around us. And I think to myself whether my reaction was not in some ways somewhat pathetic, to be quite honest, because what did I do? I went to 2 or 3 shelves and I picked out just all those books because they were all signed copies. copies signed to me by friends, by professors, by very eminent writers in some cases. I said, well, I can replace other books probably, but I can't replace many of these. But I really thought to myself, isn't that somewhat, in a way, pathetic? Because one wants to be philosophical about such things, right? What does it mean to have memories? What do books mean to one? And I don't want to pretend that I don't have an attachment to my books. I do. I love them. Those 30,000 books are like children to me, like my children to me. I've adopted them. Yeah? And so they mean something in that way. But as a lover of books who also realizes the gifts of storytelling and the richness of those libraries that have never existed, but exist as repositories of stories, of thoughts, I want to think of all of that and think along with people like Proust. Because to think that way means to become thoughtful, reflective, and self-reflective. And if one has done a lifetime of reading, that should be enough to carry the day, even when adversity strikes. Thank you. That I've said or that interests you.
Good evening, sir. So, at one point you said that there was a relationship between the development of middle class and the public library. And then after a few passages, you also said that unread books are essential part of library. So, connecting these two, I have, in my own experience, I have seen, like, my mother has always told me, so when you buy a book, you should complete it before buying the next one. So is that why the development of middle class and the public library, the relation does not exist in India? Because we always think that if we are spending on books, we should, complete the whole book before spending more. Like, parents discourage children to just collect the books.
Okay, let me explain what I meant by the observation I made when I spoke about the relationship between the middle class and the public library. Okay, it'll take 2-3 minutes. I think it'll give us a very good sense of how we should be thinking about what is a middle class. The middle class as a category, as a sociological category, is very elastic. If you read the economists and the sociologists, public policy planners, people in the government, they'll tell you the Indian middle class is 300 million, 350 million. The scholars will tell you it's anywhere between 125 to 350 million. Okay? It's a very elastic idea, and of course, much also depends on what you do with the poverty line. So every government has fudged the poverty line. The present government is particularly notorious. Let's be very clear about that, about fudging things like the poverty line. But let's not get into that. Here's the crux of the matter. The crux of the matter is simply this, that if you look at England. Let's begin with England. Why? Because England was the first country to have a middle class. It was the first country to have a middle class because it had something called the Industrial Revolution. All right? Now, the middle class, as it grew in numbers, began to exercise its influence, but critically, what it began to do was to invest in the notion of goods that are in common, or goods that we might describe as public goods. So what are public goods? The library system is one, street lighting is another. Okay? Now, to understand that, let me just move to the present for a moment, and you'll understand exactly what I mean. So I live in California, and I get a property tax bill. I get a property tax bill which is about $11,500 per year. The property tax bill gives a breakdown. It says $800 of my taxes are going to the public school system, 800 are going to the public library, whatever the exact number. I'm just giving a random number, but it's close to that, $800, $900, $1,000. And $1,000 are going to the local community college. Now, I cannot, let's supposing I didn't have any children. I cannot call the state and tell them that, look, you've got to remove these elements from my property tax bill because I don't have children. So why should I be contributing $1,000 for the community college system? And why should I be contributing $1,000 for the public school system? And I can't tell them that don't take out $800 for the public library because I've never gone to the public library. Right? I never use it. Let's say I never use it, and so no. Because the supposition is that you're contributing to the greater common good. You're contributing to the greater common good. Whether you have children or not is immaterial. This is what you pay. What I'm saying now is, therefore, that the origins of the middle class in countries such as England and subsequently France, Scandinavian countries, the United States, in that order roughly, going to Germany and Italy, because Germany and Italy were unified much later on, right? In all of these countries, in what is now called Western Europe and the United States, the Anglophone world, and Western Europe, the development of the middle class meant an investment in such things as a public library system, because it was recognized that such a system is something that exists for the greater common good. My simple submission to you is this, that in India, the idea of a middle class never has had that historical relationship. In fact, I would argue the opposite. I would argue that what the middle class has done is it's opted out of all the things that are public, so to speak. To the extent that they can, they never use the public transportation system. And back in my days, and some of you here will recognize this, in Delhi, for example, you had MTNL. And suddenly it became completely obsolete virtually. It was a state-run telephone system because everyone started going into things like Airtel and so on. And so in fact, when you even use the phrase landline, to even use the phrase landline or the word landline meant that you came from an era when there was something called a phone that was plugged into the wall, okay, all right, as opposed to the kind of mobile digital systems that you have today, right? Now, what happened? The middle class in our country, in India, completely eschewed any notion of the greater common good. And that included the public library system. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't have anything to do at all with whether one finishes a book or not. And in fact, by the way, one of the very interesting things about going to used bookstores, okay, you'll see how I'm coming into finishing books in a different way now. One of the very interesting things about going to used bookstores is when you buy a used book, you find vast majority of the books, if they're marked at all, only the first 3 pages are marked. The vast majority of people never go beyond the first few pages of a book. I've seen that in thousands of books. Thousands of books. The first 3 pages will be penciled or somebody would have made some observation, and then the rest of the book is completely neat. Not a single remark or underlining by anybody. The vast majority of books are never finished by the readers, and there's no reason for you to feel guilty about it. I've just spent a whole hour trying to explain how it is that we need to think about the different kind of ways in which we think about books, and that you can even be, as I am, a lover of books and still in some ways be philosophical and distance them in some ways. You know? And here I haven't even taken up a whole set of other problems, and those problems have to do with the Brahminical relationship to books, for example, and what are the implications of that in India, you know, which is a whole set of other considerations, because that would take us, you know, into a different stream of thought altogether. So I don't know if that sort of addresses the question, you know, that had been posed.
Hello, Dr. Lal. You spoke about how when you visit other people's libraries, you sort of judge them and think, oh, this is not such a great library or what. I'd like to know, what are the parameters you use to curate a good library? Or what are the parameters you look at to assess someone's library?
You know, look, I mean, if there are too many of these self-help books, you know, Chicken Soup for Dummies, or, you know, whatever those books are called, you can immediately write those off. Okay, let's begin with what you can write off, you know. But again, as I said, you see, if you are an inveterate reader of books, an inveterate reader of the printed word, everything will catch your eye, however bad it might be. You know, there's a very well-known writer. She passed away a short time ago. Celebrated, won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Alice Munro, Canadian writer. And she has written in a portion of her memoirs that, you know, she would sit at the breakfast table when she was very young and first started reading the labels on cereal boxes. You know, if you grow up in North America or Canada, there'll be a cereal box on the breakfast table, for sure. And so she says that some of the first words she learned were words like niacin and fluoxin, you know, all these chemicals that are in there. So her vocabulary consisted of a large number of these very, what I would call esoteric words overall, because they're not part of the working vocabulary of most people, okay? So going back to your question, I'm saying that, look, on one hand, I'm saying that even, you know, a newspaper that is poorly written, a book that's poorly written, that's uninteresting, all of that, someone who has an interest in the written word can do something with it. But as to the question of what are the parameters of a good library, there is no blueprint for that. And there cannot be and should not be. Because really the question is, what triggers off the imagination? What is the nature of free association? How does one begin to think about the world of books and how one inhabits them? How does one form a relationship? A good library is a library that you form a relationship to in a certain way. And therefore, to that extent, if that person is entirely content in having, you know, the 50 volumes of Chicken Soup for Dummies, you know, set, or whatever it is that set is, or, you know, 7 steps to, you know, happiness, 15 steps to happiness. I think there should be things like 15 steps to, you know, unhappiness. That would be more interesting, frankly, I think. Now, if someone is content with that and is able to form a relationship with it and it generates a set of thoughts, I wouldn't have any necessary objection, because I wouldn't want to create a hierarchy. But it seems to me that speaking civilizationally, we do create hierarchies. That is that, then now we get to a different dimension of the question, because then the question is not simply what I think. The question is, what is the greater opinion? What is the common opinion? And how is that opinion formed about what constitutes a good library? So why are some university libraries good and others aren't? Right? So that would mean that we would then need a different set of parameters to think about what constitutes a good library. Yeah. That would be the briefest way to put it, but I can tell you this, that in a lifetime of obviously collecting books and hoarding them and all of that, and you have to have an appetite for it, I can tell you. You have to have an appetite. So for example, when I was very young, when I was in my late teens, so I was staying with my mother in Baltimore. This is when I went to Johns Hopkins. And so we had a very small apartment. And, there were as many books as you could fit really on the shelf. But I still had an appetite. So what would I do? I would go to the local bookstore, bring back 2 bags of books, and put them behind a bush. Then at night, when my mother had fallen asleep, then I would go out, collect the books, bring them back in, and store them behind the front layer of books. When it came time a year and a half later to pack everything and we had to leave for the United States, she was absolutely astonished, because she only knew of the 1,000 or 500 books that were there, and then behind that there were 2 other layers, right? Well, that's how one collected books. And that's what the passion was, for collecting books, right? So in a lifetime of doing this kind of thing, what I have learned simply is that, when you walk into a bookstore, let the book grab you. Don't always grab the book, let the book grab you. And that means you must always allow room for things like serendipity. And you must allow room for discovery and for wandering, right? That's, I think, how to think about books and how one actually acquires a good collection. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah.
Where is the question coming from?
Yeah. At the beginning of the lecture, you said a quote that to read is to think with someone else's mind. At the end of the day, would you say it's like the other way around? Like, to read is to think with your own mind? Because
yes, I mean, that's a possibility. Remember that to read with somebody else, to read is to think with somebody else's mind. This is a quotation from Schopenhauer. All right? So I mentioned that this is a thought shared by Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is an early 19th century German philosopher and Indologist, deeply, by the way, very deeply influenced by Indian thought. And someone who had read the Upanishads in particular. Now, I mentioned that because he had a particular interest in the Upanishads. And I think that if you think about the life world of the Upanishads, right, what are the ways in which one acquires something called knowledge? Right? So the Upanishads are the fount in many ways of the whole school of Indian philosophy, which is Advaita Vedanta. Right? They're the fount of that. And there the idea of the acquisition of knowledge has very much to do with trying to understand the essence of things. The essence of things. So Schopenhauer's concern was that when you read, you're thinking along with them. And therefore you're inheriting their worldview. It's not the worldview that you acquire through a certain interrogation and a certain experience yourself. But as I suggested, that's only one way to think about the relationship between the writer and the reader. Right? Because Schopenhauer's comment is also an observation about the relationship between a writer and a reader. Right? And there, I can only emphasize what I had said in my remarks, which is that there are multiple perspectives from which you can enter this question of the relationship of the writer to the reader. Some people think that the writer's authority in some sense guides the reader. Some, in fact, have taken the view that what is wonderful about the act of reading a book is that the reader actually takes possession of the writer. Right? When you put the book aside, what have you done? You put the writer to sleep. When you pick it up again, you've, in a sense, awakened the writer. The alarm clock went off. You know? So there, I would suggest that rather than trying to get a grip exactly on how you want to think through it, you just let your mind work with all of these possibilities. Yeah.
Guys, we have 5 minutes left. We have time for one more question if anyone wants to ask.
Hello, sir. I just wanted to ask, like, you said you didn't, do you think that the burning of the Manusmriti was a wrong act? Or like,
Can you speak up a bit?
I was asking, do you think the burning of Manusmriti was the wrong act despite the message that it, gave to society? And like, if so, like, how would you be preferred if not to be burned? Then how would you prefer a book that doesn't exactly have the right message for society?
Yes. Yeah, so, look, I mean, there are two different parts to your question in a way. One has to do with my own view of the Manusmriti, right? I mean, effectively, to answer that question, I have to sort of give you a brief sense of that. And see, my own view of the matter is that you have to look at it as part of a class of literature that was produced in India, the Dharma Shastras, okay, which set out various kinds of codes of conduct. Now, this law book unquestionably has passages that are deeply offensive. Of course, there are a great many books that have passages that are deeply offensive. The Ramcharitmanas has some notorious passages, by the way. But the Ramcharitmanas is, in North India, I can tell you, probably the most loved of all the works of literature, of devotional literature. Right? And we would obviously have to get a sense of how we would assess the Manusmriti in relationship to the other Dharma Shastras and in relationship to the other classes of literature. Okay? Because if I am trying to understand what is the relationship of the Varnas to a certain social phenomena, I have to go to a work like the Manusmriti. In some ways, it's an indispensable legal code to a certain time. The second part of your question, so I said that I objected, and I stated that quite deliberately, because I stand by that. I object to the burning of books. And why do I object to the burning of books? I object to the burning of books because we have to understand that when we think of violence, we have to think of violence not simply in its physical dimension. We have to think of the ontological, ethical, and epistemological dimension of violence. Now, in this case, it is the epistemological dimension of violence that is crucial. And when I say the epistemological dimension of violence, what do I mean very simply? What I mean by that very simply is this, that the person who is burning a book has tacitly adopted the view that there is nothing whatsoever in that book which can be recovered. That is, that it is all a tissue of falsehoods. And I think, by the way, that if you look at a point of view which is very much part of the ethos of Western India, that is, if you look at the Jain view of Anek Anantavad, that is the many perspectiveness of reality, right, which is very nicely captured in the parable of the 6 wise men, the 6 blind men, I should say, and the elephant. I don't know how many of you know that parable. It's a parable that originated actually in India, right, where 6 blind men are asked to describe an elephant, and each gives an answer, because one blind man, for example, touches a portion of the elephant, the main body, and says the elephant is a wall. The other touches the tail and says that the elephant is like a snake or a rope, etc. And what does the Jain school of Anekanantavad argue? What it argues is that all of these views are partially wrong and partially right. Right? Now that, I think, was very much, in some ways, the perspective that was intrinsic to Gandhi's notion of ahimsa. And you notice that I barely talked about Gandhi, although in the subtitle I said how I went from James Hadley Chase and Nick Carter to Borhe, Mohandas Gandhi, and another person whom I didn't even mention in the talk at all, Ashish Nandi. Right? So the answer to your question really is precisely in trying to understand what is the epistemological nature of the violence contained in the act of the burning of a book. And that's my fundamental problem with the burning of a book. The fact that I object to that doesn't mean that I'm trying to validate necessarily the Manusmriti in its entirety, or even any of it necessarily. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
With this, we'll be wrapping up this session. Sir, thank you so much for coming here. You've given us some really diverse perspectives and point of views.
Thank you.
It has all given us something to ponder upon. Once again, thank you so much.